wonderful attendance this morning at this panel that was surely going to be really interesting. I'm Katie Jo LaRiviere, and I will moderate this session. We'll progress through papers one after the other and then have time for questions at the end. And so I'll just introduce everyone one by one as they come up. So this is Amber Shrewsbury. She's a second-year master's student at Portland State University. Her scholarship focuses on cartographic representations of the classical and medieval worlds. A geographer by training, she has always been interested in the ways in which geography and culture collide to reflect how societies define themselves and to understand their place in the world. The talk you will hear today is an introduction to her thesis topic, and she appreciates your feedback and questions. Amber.
On the 25th of January, 1508, German humanist Conrad Kelties bequeathed an old map, which he then called the Itinerarium Antonii Pii, to his friend and fellow antiquarian, Conrad Peutinger. Kelties, who served as imperial librarian to Emperor Maximilian I, and has been called both a passionate, unscrupulous collector of manuscripts, as well as a notorious book thief, reportedly discovered the map in a monastic library that remains unidentified by scholars today, possibly, even probably, through unlawful means. The Peutinger map, as it is now known, currently resides in the Austrian National Library in Vienna, and paleography has dated it to the latter half of the long 12th century. The history of the map before 1500 is extremely scant. In fact, nearly everything about it currently remains lost to history. Kelties and Peutinger were, in the 16th century, very interested in objects and artifacts that connected their German Roman Empire to the ancient Roman Empire and the authority it engendered, which, I will argue in this talk, is the very same desire that led to the creation of the Peutinger map during the 12th century reign of Frederick Barbarossa. The Peutinger map is an enigmatic map with no explicit lineage. It is a medieval cartographical representation of the Roman Empire, but it has no clear purpose, author, nor any known provenance. The dimensions of the Peutinger map are one of the many ways in which it is unusual and unique among medieval maps. It is extremely long and very skinny, an elongated rectangle composed of 11 pieces of parchment, and the surviving segments measure approximately 33 centimeters tall and 672 centimeters long, roughly 13 inches tall and 22 feet long. This ratio resembles a scroll rather than pages from a manuscript or a codex. The 11 pieces of parchment were joined together prior to the copying process and were not sewn, but glued together, an atypical medieval practice. The surviving segments of the Peutinger map depict the Roman Empire at its largest extent, from Britain and Spain to India, North Africa, and parts of Germany. I say surviving segments because it is thought that at some point the map had multiple additional segments that the Peutinger map currently does not have, such as a segment on the left edge that contains the majority of the British Isles and Spain. Without these surviving segments, the current map's western edge terminates at the very southeastern edge of Britain. Beyond this, I will not engage about potential additional segments that have been lost, since the surviving map has no such segments. Finally, the Peutinger map is also intentionally anachronistic, for example, by including the city of Pompeii, even though the city had been destroyed in 79 CE. And at times using Roman names for place names that had long gone out of fashion by the 12th century. The surviving map, though created within the larger milieu of medieval cartography, does not ascribe to the familiar formula of the genre. The map forgoes Christian imagery in favor of depicting a secular and pagan worldview. It shows the inhabited world from Britain to Sri Lanka and utilizes 70,000 miles of Roman roads, with locations marked with their Latin names. Richard Talbert refers to the Peutinger map as Roman in character, even if not necessarily in date. Due to the map's unusual dimensions, most geographical features are significantly distorted, more so along the edges. Due to their centrality, Rome and Italy are the least distorted of the locations featured. This means that the mapmaker likely took care to establish Rome at the center, at the expense of distorting other features and locations, thus marginalizing them in an effort to highlight Rome's centrality and supremacy. Roman road networks, drawn in red, are also elevated above other topographical features and locations, highlighting their relative importance. Notably, both Constantinople and Jerusalem have been relatively relegated to the margins. The map also does not adhere to the popular and traditional TO style seen in the majority of Mappamundi, and the marginalization of Jerusalem in particular does not conform, since in nearly every medieval map, Jerusalem was situated at the center of the world. The Peutinger map also does not resemble any known ancient map. While ancient Greek cartography is well known through the works of geographers such as Eratosthenes, Herodotus, and Ptolemy, there is little to no evidence of a Roman mapping tradition. However, this does not mean that the Romans did not value geographical knowledge. Roman geographical knowledge seems to have been almost universally transmitted textually through lists of written itineraries, land surveys, and geographical writings by authors like Pliny the Elder, Strabo, Pomponius Mela, and Orosius. The only known visual map of Rome was a 3rd century CE administrative map of the city, the Forma Urbis Romae, commissioned by the Emperor Septimius Severus. This monumental map was displayed on the site of a building for reasons that remain poorly understood. While it is possible that the Romans did have a visual mapping tradition, extant sources have offered little evidence to support this hypothesis. So, to recap, the Peutinger map differs significantly from ancient and medieval traditions. Because of this discrepancy, it is understandable why scholars have thought of the map as a likely descendant from an as-yet-to-be-uncovered Roman mapping tradition, rather than an anachronistic deviation from a well-known medieval one. 3 main hypotheses dominate current scholarship on the Peutinger map. The 3 scholars at the fore of the debate over the map's origins are Richard Talbert, Emily Albu, and Michael Ratman. The classicist Richard Talbert has written many articles as well as a monograph on the topic and has done much to further legitimize the consensus view that the Peutinger map is not an original creation of the 12th century, but instead a copy of a lost Roman original. He argues for an original prototype that dates to the Diocletian Tetrarchy of late imperial Rome, sometime around the year 300 CE and before Constantine's conversion and the Edict of Milan. Emily Albu, whose research spans both the classical period as well as the Middle Ages, acknowledges that the scholarly consensus is heavily weighted toward an ancient prototype. Albu instead argues that the map may be of Carolingian origin. Her argument is bolstered by evidence of the Carolingian interest in Roman culture, literature, and power structures. The connection between the Carolingians and the Roman Empire was constructed by Charlemagne and his court, inferring that the Carolingians were the inheritors of the old Roman world, as well as its imperial authority. Michael Ratman offers a 3rd hypothesis about the genesis of the Peutinger map, using debate about the 1st century map of Agrippa to argue for an even older Peutinger prototype. Classicists have understandably wanted to claim the Peutinger map as their own, hoping to find concrete evidence of a Roman cartographical practice. The map of Agrippa, which is thought to have been completed by the Emperor Augustus, has been argued to be the long-lost prototype for the Peutinger map. Now, whether the map of Agrippa even existed is a matter of intense scholarly debate, but for the sake of this argument, let's assume that it does. Ratman uses the connection between the Peutinger map and the map of Agrippa to introduce his argument, stating that Roman geographical knowledge could not exist without Greek forerunners, and as such, the Peutinger map is ultimately descended from a Hellenistic prototype. The provenance of the Peutinger map is also disputed. Scholars have suggested potential locations for the production of the map, all southern German monasteries, and the only monastery mentioned by Talbert, Albu, and Ratman is Reichenau Abbey in Constance. Paleographical analysis on the Peutinger map has been unable to clarify with any certainty which South German abbey produced the map, so any guesses, including Reichenau, are speculation. So despite centuries of scholarship, nearly every concrete fact about the Peutinger map's origins, its provenance, and the reasons for its production remain tantalizingly just out of reach. I am not interested in proving the existence or not of a Peutinger prototype. Instead, I am interested in why medieval scholars have not been more interested in the Peutinger map. I believe that the map deserves to be studied on its own terms as a product of its own time and place. I have chosen to explore how the Peutinger map makes sense as a piece of Hohenstaufen propaganda originating from the imperial chancery of Frederick Barbarossa and his successors. The Peutinger map is a fundamentally medieval creation, born out of the crises, power struggles, and instability of 12th century Europe. When considering what patron may have wanted to commission a secular map of the Roman Empire, the Stauffer kings emerge as prime suspects. To borrow a term from the criminal justice system, they had the motive, the means, and the opportunity. First, the motive and the opportunity. The 12th century was a turbulent era of cultural change, as well as a flashpoint for conflict between secular and papal authorities. Conflicts between church and state were exemplified most notably through the investiture controversy, in which the church aimed to take away the ability for secular authorities to select and install bishops. The papacy considered its sacred and temporal authority to be increasingly in danger, and saw the German kings as their primary threat. As the papacy increasingly began to reassert its authority, secular German officials became increasingly hostile. After the German princes elected Frederick Barbarossa king of the Romans in 1152, Swabia, the region where the Peutinger map is thought to have been made, became the center of secular resistance to the papacy. And after being crowned emperor by Pope Adrian IV in 1155, imperial relations with the papacy declined rapidly, and Frederick's reign would come to be defined by his break with the Holy See, after he interfered in the papal election of 1160, which resulted in a decades-long schism. Frederick absolutely did not want to be seen as the Pope's vassal, and spent the rest of his life constructing a divinely ordained secular empire, whose authority came directly from God and did not require the involvement of the Pope. Frederick Barbarossa's imperial ambitions were bolstered by the recovery of Roman law in the 12th century. This event happened at precisely the right moment in time for Frederick, who utilized it as a way to legitimize his claim as ruler of the world. Frederick made known that he believed his power to be God-ordained, but had also been decreed by the German princes who had elected him, rather than his papal coronation, thereby proclaiming that his imperial authority was supported by both God and Roman law. Promoters of Frederick Barbarossa strove to construct an image of the Stauffers and elevate Frederick, as well as the status of the empire, by linking them and their authority to imperial Rome. Propagandists within the royal court, as well as the emperor himself, took part in styling Frederick as the next in a long line of Roman emperors. Frederick's biographers, Otto of Freising and Rowan, as well as others, utilized classical tropes and sources in imperial documents that favored comparisons to Augustus and the government and literature of the early empire, as well as later comparisons to Charlemagne and Christian Rome. Suetonius' Life of Augustus, Orosius' History Against the Pagans, Einhard's Life of Charlemagne, and the letters of Sidonius Apollinaris are but a few of the works that were borrowed from in the creation of Frederick's biography. His reign was compared to the Pax Augusta, an unprecedented era of peace, and Otto stressed the strength of Frederick's auctoritas, which he said made barbarians and Greeks tremble in Frederick's presence. There is a well-documented body of evidence showing how the Stauffers waged a propaganda war against the papacy that was at times both secular and Roman in nature. They also had the means to produce such a complex and intentionally anachronistic map. 12th century monastic institutions would certainly have had access to the breadth of information necessary to create the Peutinger map, even if they were starting from scratch. Manuscripts of Roman itinerary lists, including the Antonine and Bordeaux itineraries, as well as the later Ravenna cosmography, had been copied and preserved in medieval monasteries during the Carolingian Renaissance, along with classical literature and geographical texts. The geographic worldview of classical authors such as Pliny the Elder still held importance in the medieval world. Late antique and early medieval writers, including Isidore of Seville, used geography as a means to legitimize their works by drawing attention to and often emulating their classical antecedents. And Pliny's first century geographical treatise, Natural History, was copied so widely by Carolingian monasteries that it profoundly influenced medieval culture. It is not surprising then that the geographical range depicted in the Peutinger map is extremely similar to the world described by Pliny. I traveled to Vienna last December to see the facsimile of the Peutinger map in person, and I'm so grateful to have been given the opportunity to do so. I'm just beginning my analysis of the map now, but I can share a few of the elements that stood out to me. There are 3 cities that have been elevated among all others on the map and feature their own personifications: Rome, Constantinople, and Antioch. Traditional Roman personifications of cities were female, but the Peutinger map depicts male figures for each city. The figure of Rome looks very imperial, sitting on a throne, wearing a toga and an imperial crown. The figure holds other traditional symbols of power: an orb, shield, and scepter. It is also obvious to me when looking at the figure of Rome that Rome is meant to be the center of the map and is the first thing a viewer's eyes will settle on. The red ink used for the Roman road network stands out and shows that the roads are a particularly important element. The roads of the Roman road network all converge at Rome, putting the figure, set within a circle, at the center of the world. Enter "all roads lead to Rome" joke here, but it truly applies in this instance. The figures representing Constantinople and Antioch are more puzzling. Constantinople's figure is viewed partially from the side and is pointing at a statue holding an orb. Antioch's picture looks disproportionately large comparative to Constantinople and even to Rome. All 3 figures look imperial in nature, but each wears a different headpiece, and only the personification of Antioch is haloed, which makes it appear more medieval than the other 2. Another question I have about Antioch is why that city is so highlighted, while Alexandria, which was of similar importance to the Romans, does not seem to appear on the map at all. And while I knew going in that Jerusalem was relegated to the margins as almost an afterthought, when exploring the facsimile, I was still surprised by how long it took me to even find Jerusalem on the map. It seems surprisingly unimportant. This is where my research stands today. I am working to show that while the Peutinger map remains mostly an enigma and very little can be said about it for certain, what can be said is that it is a fundamentally medieval artifact, reflective of the time in which it was made. The Stolfer dynasty, beginning with Frederick Barbarossa, had the motivation and the resources to commission a 12th century map of Imperial Rome as part of their ongoing mission to establish themselves as the inheritors of the ancient empire. As I prepare to continue my research into the map itself this summer to further explore its connections to the 12th century world, I would love to hear any feedback or questions you may have. Thank you.